Good morning, it's still morning. I would suggest that we start, and I'm pleased to be back here again today after wonderful discussions and starting of the meeting yesterday. I understand that the morning before the coffee break you had a nice and interesting session on ecosystem services as such, and how to value them, and trying to appreciate probably or look at also some EU approaches that could be applied. Well, yesterday morning we were told by our colleagues from Ministry of Economy that people from environmentalists don't know anything about money. So I think we should prove them wrong today. And the aim of this session now is to look at the very practical examples that are either implemented or under implementation in member states. And therefore I would invite Wouter, who would tell us about example from Flanders.
Thank you, Chair, and ladies and gentlemen, for the opportunity to present the case study of Flanders here. It will be practical, but also a little bit conceptual, because I've always felt that there is nothing as practical as a good theory. Now, before taking off, I would also like to take the opportunity to express my gratitude to the Miss Ilona Menzina and her staff of the Nature Protection Department, and also the staff of the Latvian Presidency, par brīnišķīgo organizāciju šī jaukajā pilsētā un par garšīgajām maltītēm. Liels paldies! That's for the organizers, not for me. So in the next 40 slides or so, I'm going to, I can read it there, I see, say some things about RIA Flanders, Regional Ecosystem Assessment of Flanders, and I'll talk about the objective and how we approached it and some of the output of stage 1 of the assessment, which is finished now, the conceptual framework and systems approach that we used, the actual mapping and assessment of the state and trend of ecosystem services. I'll also say something about what we did with regard to nature-based solutions and how that links to the objective or the target in the biodiversity strategy with regard to 15% ecosystem restoration. I'll say something about the relationship and the relevance of biodiversity for ecosystem services. And in the end, if there's time, maybe some provocative things about valuation of ecosystem services, because I understood this morning that that always stirs up some questions. Flanders RIA is actually a 6-year process, 2 years of which we have finished now, and the output of that was NARA-T. NARA stands for Nature Report, and the T is the Flemish for State and Trend of Ecosystem Services. We have finished the first stage, and we have just taken on the second one. The objective of that state and trend assessment was, and these are the typical objectives that you find in other assessments like UK-NIA, of my British colleague here, and even the global Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. An important objective is always to increase the visibility of ecosystem services that are very often hidden to us in our day-to-day life and choices and decisions that we make, to present a knowledge base that could be a good base to start from for designing policy and governance and redesigning our institutions, to explore practical options for ecosystem management and land use decisions that focus on a more sustainable supply and maybe also more sustainable demand of ecosystem services, and to certainly to stimulate cross-sectoral communication and cooperation, because outside the nature conservation community, things like nature and ecosystems and ecosystem services do not always ring a bell. So it's often also trying to translate things into other worlds of reality without losing too much of the meaning. The biggest output of our ecosystem assessment was a big technical report of 26 chapters, the basic structure of which is presented here. There were 2 chapters defining the scope and the conceptual framework, the systems approach actually, through which we looked at ecosystems and their relationships to human well-being and society. Based on that systems approach, we mapped and assessed 16 ecosystem services on the regional scale in Flanders. And based on those 16 scientific reports, we did a horizontal cross-cutting analysis based on 8 questions. How does man affect ecosystem services? So these are the basic societal activities and drivers that affect ecosystem change and ecosystem service changes in Flanders. What is the state and trend of ecosystems and biodiversity in Flanders? What is the state and trend of the services? What is the role of biodiversity for these services? How do these services contribute to our well-being? How can we value ecosystem services? Is it just money or is there more involved? What are the interaction between ecosystem services? Because that's maybe one of the most relevant and also one of the most complex things to disentangle. Increase of one service usually leads to decreases in others, and also the way in which we use ecosystem services, a more natural or more technical way, has different impacts on other services. I'll try and show that later. And then there was still a big report on ecosystem service governance. I'm not going to dwell into that too much today, not because it's not relevant, but there are time limits. And so after 2 years, we came up with this little booklet of 80 pages. You see here the Minister of Environment and Nature in the purple jacket receiving the synthesis report from our Administrator General. She was laughing, and she even kept laughing after we presented her technical report in a nice ribbon that fantastically matched the clothing of the minister. So if you ever want a case of a science policy interface, there you have one. The output was not just this plus 1,600 pages of knowledge base, but was also a 2-year process in which over 50 authors were involved in writing. Not all full-time. We estimated it was for about 20 full-time equivalents. There were also around 180 reviewers from academia, from government agencies, mostly Flemish, but also local and provincial, and some European agencies, and also, of course, of NGOs and professional interest groups from business and agriculture and culture and welfare agencies. So, ecosystems and ecosystem services, they're all around us, whether we dwell in a forest or whether we live a luxurious life in an urban environment. Just think of the ecosystem services you have consumed today by getting here, by drinking water, by eating food, by using all the material that directly or indirectly is derived from natural sources, the air that you breathe, the climate which is made livable, the fact that the Daugava was not flooding in the streets, etc., etc. We are totally, fundamentally dependent on them. Here you see an abstraction of the 16 ecosystem services, 4 or 5 provisioning ones, one cultural service and the other regulating services that we analyzed for Flanders. And this is the lens, these are the glasses through which we have looked at these ecosystems and their services and the relationship actually between ecosystems, economic welfare and human well-being. For those of you who have been involved longer in ecosystem services literature, academic or policy-oriented literature, you may recognize the ecosystem cascade that was developed by Roy Haynes-Young and Marianne Potchin of the UK. We looked at that scheme and also at the schemes in other assessments like Eugenio, also in the TEEP reports, and we tried to adapt them a little bit to well, not to reinvent the wheel, but to make the vehicle more accessible or manageable for the Flemish roads, which is a rather urbanized and or urbanizing area. Actually, when you talk about ecosystems in Flanders, well, it's a densely populated region of about 6 million people, the territory of which is between 1/4 and 1/5 of Latvia. Farmland is still the most extensive land use, consisting of cropland and cultivated grassland. So most of the light green and all the yellow is farmland, but that's decreasing, and land use or the ecosystem, and it's actually more a social ecosystem that is almost as extensive now, is the urban area, the grey, which is already around 30% of Flanders. Now, not all of that is concrete and really stone or paved area. You see that in the smaller frame, that a big part of the urban area also consists of green. High green, like street trees or small urban parks, but also low green, like the grass alongside the road, the private gardens. Actually, on the one hand an anecdote, but on the other hand also very fundamental if you want to implement something like ecosystem services in Flanders or any urbanized area. 8% of Flanders consists of gardens. So if you know that a forest in Flanders is between 11 and 12% of the territory, you see that our gardens are already 2/3 of our forests. So that's a very important area to take into account. It's not just all about Natura 2000 and nature reserves when you're talking about ecosystem services. All the other ones, including the wetland, the heathlands, the water bodies, the coastal area, the inland dunes and the estuaries, they cover around 4%. So that gives you a bit of the order of magnitude. And so we've tried to use this conceptual framework as a systems approach to more or less in a consistent way look at these very, very different ecosystem services and ecosystems. Because especially when you start to operationalize the concept, to link it to policy instruments, to financing schemes, you see that there is a Babylonian confusion in terms that are related to each other. Ecological functions, services, benefits, values, especially if you want to attach financial flows or legal responsibilities to them, they're often piled on one heap, and what to some is a service is to others a function, or to other a benefit, and even to others a value, be it economic or other type of value. So in our approach, ecosystems are sets of ecological structures and processes, many of which perform functions that are beneficial to human. The output of these functions is a supply of ecosystem services. Now there's also from society a demand on ecosystem services, and that demand is triggered by direct and indirect drivers. Our demographic evolutions, but also our tastes and preferences in terms of what we want and what we like, how government and economic systems and technology affect on that. Those are all indirect drivers that affect a demand for ecosystem services. For instance, the type of food that we decide to buy when we go into a supermarket. It was mentioned this morning, if we buy bio food, it has a different impact on a direct driver like land use for farmers than if we decide to buy the cheapest food available. So these drivers are really very important in the area that we were studying, and that's why we also put them center stage. The use of our ecosystem services delivers benefits, all kinds of social outcomes like safety, health, housing, etc. And those social outcomes we value. We value them in a variety of ways. This morning there was in the previous section, there was a big focus on intrinsic versus economic values, but well, if the intrinsic values are stated from an ecocentric or a biocentric approach, the anthropocentric approach has values that are much broader than just the economic values. There are fundamental socio-cultural values involved that are not able to monetization at all, or for which economics does not provide reliable methods. I'll show you an example of it later. So there's a wider range of values, and how we perceive the benefits of those ecosystems and how we value them in turn affects our choices, the human choices that we make individually, but also collectively. And those choices tend to solidify into institutions, in markets and market behavior, in market structures, also in governments, because voting the ballot is also a form of social choice. Also all kinds of social networks, they all affect these direct and indirect drivers and in turn affect land use. So putting all that together has been our strategy of trying to map and assess ecosystem services. I give you one example of how we mapped ecosystem service supply for one service, namely wood production. We first looked at the map of Flanders and tried to model and predict how many wood would be produced per hectare depending on the abiotic soil characteristics, regardless of whether there were houses standing or farming or other activities. And then you see that in the most ideal circumstances, there would be an annual growth of wood for timber or for fuel or whatever of up to 22 cubic meters per hectare. Now, of course, Flanders is not particularly a forest. Our forest cover is, like I said, between 11 and 12%, and that includes the urban green. So if you look at the amount of wood that we could potentially harvest if we were to cut all timber that is standing or all wood that is standing, the map would already be very different. Now, even if you only look at where the forests are at this time growing, not all wood is there for harvesting, because many of these forests are managed in a sustainable way or are even part of a nature reserve or are simply standing in a private gardens where they are not meant to be wood producing services either. So if we go from that potential supply to the actual supply that can be annually harvested, the map is still different. So those types of supply maps we try to make for 16 services. Now, apart from ecosystem supply, there's also ecosystem demand, and when you want to be sure whether you're behaving in a sustainable way, you need to check whether your demand is not exceeding your supply. Especially for provisioning services, mapping demand is not always easy and also not always meaningful. For instance, in terms of wood, what is the demand for wood? Is it the wood harvester? Is it the wood processing industry? Are those the individuals that buy furniture or that burn wood in their stove? You cannot always meaningfully map that, but you can quantify it to the extent that you have data. And so we collected data on supply but also on demand and put them together in infographics. And then you see, for instance, that in Flanders about 1 million cubic meter of wood is harvested annually, only 1/4 of which is used in wood processing industry, and 3/4 of it is burnt by people at home. It can be the Christmas tree, it can be a wood stove, it can be a wood in a barbecue, things like that. At the Belgian scale, we have about 7 million cubic meters that is produced annually per year, and that's because in Wallonia, the southern region, there is much more forest cover and also much more forestry as an economic activity. But in total, there is 12 million cubic meter that is imported. So actually our domestic wood production or supply is far lower than the demand for it. These types of analysis we did for 16 ecosystem services. And so that was sort of our interpretation of meeting with Target 2, Action 5 of the Biodiversity Strategy. We also put together those maps not just in big technical reports, but in a web application that can be consulted online, where the data are shown in the metadata and where also the files can be downloaded for more spatial analysis. So the shape files are available there. And then in a synthesis report, we brought together the assessment of those separate services. There's a lot of information on this slide and on the next one. I'm not going to detail into all of it, but just will show you some highlights of it. The the color of the shading expresses the scientific reliability that we attach to what we claim in this slide. The first column shows you 16 ecosystem services with a little icon representing it that returns throughout the reports. Then the first column shows the demand, and the arrows indicate whether the demand for this service is increasing. I skipped the next column, and then the third color in the matrix is showing the supply. And there the arrow shows whether the supply of this service on a regional scale is increasing or decreasing. Now, for 8 of the 16 ecosystem services, the supply of services from Flanders is decreasing. For 15 of the 16 services, demand for the service is greater than the supply in Flanders. So this actually translates to for the Flemish region what we already saw in the slide yesterday about the planetary boundaries and exceeding some capacities there. Our demand for ecosystem services in Flanders is bigger than our local supply, and we can only sustain our welfare and well-being by importing services from abroad. Now, if all countries in the world are going to do that, then, well, you know where you end up. Okay. Where do those trends come from? Well, we've actually identified the main drivers. This slide shows the direct drivers in the columns. And here the depth of the color does not indicate the scientific reliability, but the severity of the driver. You see in the first 2 columns that land use, because of urbanization or because of agricultural activities, are among the strongest drivers on ecosystem services in Flanders. In case of urbanization, the driver is expected to increase. That's why the arrows goes up. In case of agriculture, the arrows go down, which means that the pressure from agriculture is expected to decrease because just the service of agricultural activity is decreasing, and also because we expect that, or we see that the environmental pressure from agriculture is also slowly decreasing, also, although not as fast as from other sectors.
Wouter, you think you can, in 3 to 4 minutes, finish?
Okay, I will skip some things, but yes, I can. I'll say a couple of things about the nature-based solutions. Target 2 speaks of the biodiversity strategy, speaks of ecosystem restoration. Now, we cannot turn a region like Flanders into a nature reserve, but in the multifunctional open space, we can try to make our use of ecosystem services more nature-based. For instance, in terms of food production, well, we will not expect ourselves to be collecting berries or shooting wild boars, since the most technical alternative is food production in greenhouses, there are ways to shift a little bit to the left. And what you see if you start or try to use ecosystems in a more natural way is that you try to base your use less on technical input and more on natural processes, and you see that more natural systems that come with it provide a wider array of ecosystem services than just the technical solutions. And that may be an approach to try and stop the decrease of 8 of the 16 services that you have noticed. Second last thing about biodiversity and ecosystem services. Biodiversity is a house with many rooms, and it can be defined on multiple scales: genes, species, ecosystems, landscapes, and you can look at it from different angles. And typical nature conservation approach of biodiversity looks mostly at the species level or the habitat and ecosystem level, but the 3 other angles which relate to stocks or ecological functions and processes or ecosystem and landscape structures, they are very relevant for ecosystems now and for ecosystem services. Now, if we look at our indicators in the left graph, most of the nature conservation indicators look only at the angle and in the upper right quadrant based on species diversity and a little bit habitat diversity. The other angles are dimensions of biodiversity that are not very well covered by our policy indicators. The indicators of the Water Framework Directive, on the other hand, have a more balanced approach. So maybe if changing our legislation is something that we're focusing on, then also trying to cover biodiversity in a more balanced way or a more complete way could be an approach. At this moment, we are certainly not measuring what we want to manage. Then I go to my last slides. We've also looked at valuation of ecosystem services. For instance, what do our farmlands yield in terms of marketed food production? And then you see values per hectare that go up to over 6,400 euros. Now, if you in these same fields were to plant trees, even the most productive trees adapted to the soil, you would in that same area get an economic yield of around 230. So why are farmers opposed to forest expansion in their land? Well, because it does not pay their bills, of course. Now, farmers' land use decisions are to a big extent determined by market forces and to the economic yield that they get from it. But what if we would be able to include in the calculus the yields, the economic benefits of ecosystem services that are not funded through the market, because a farmer cannot sell fresh air or the carbon that is stored in the soil if he were to plant a forest there. This map shows you the net benefits if our current farmlands would be forested, and of course they go very deep in the red. If you extract the subsidies from it, because that's actually a solidarity mechanism and not really a yield from the land, you see that these losses are a bit lower already, but still considerable. If you add the carbon value that would be stored in those forests, you see that in some areas you already get modest profits. And if you would add the recreation value, you see that in many areas, especially the ones that are densely populated and do not have forests for recreation in the neighborhood at all, that they would have high economic yields. Unfortunately, our institutions are not fostering these land uses, because even if it would be socially more beneficial, a farmer is not compensated for these values if he would make different land use decisions. So we need new institutions. And with that, I think, because I don't want to impose too much on the time of the next speakers, I will leave it at that. Thank you for your attention, and if there are any questions, later.
Thank you, Wouter, very much for your presentation indeed. And I'm sure there are questions in the audience, but I would suggest to keep them for a bit later, because we have 3 more panelists, and the questions might be also kind of related to or addressed to other of them, others as well. So I would now like to invite Eugenio, who is from Italy and works in the Ministry of Environment, responsible for Nature Biodiversity Strategy and implementation, and he will also tell us about Italian example of assessing of ecosystem services and green infrastructure. Please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presidency for this opportunity. And I will start recalling some of the activity we had 6 months ago, which is very in line with what we are discussing now. we agreed on this Charter of Rome on natural and cultural capital. It was also presented at the Council of Environment Ministries in December. And I show very briefly, most of you know already this charter, the main topics addressed in it. The objective was to increase awareness on the synergies among natural and cultural capital. And this is one, in our view, the most evident or direct connection among the several different capitals Laurent mentioned already yesterday. And it's the opportunity to integrate biodiversity into other sectors, and at least in Italian experience, that of cultural capital and under many aspects, tourism is one of the main focus, is one opportunity to develop a greener economy, and this is a driving force to promote biodiversity conservation, since it is an opportunity for more jobs and for human well-being. And it's not only the conservation itself, it's an opportunity for a long-lasting sustainable development. To this, I show you briefly what we are doing in Italy in this respect. And I start from the MAES process activities. We mapped the ecosystem of Italy all over Italy. We started, or we made this mapping in 91 categories. Later on, also reduced for some analysis to 24 categories. And from this ecosystem map, we started in analyzing the services, also with maps, and we mostly focused on 5 pilot ecosystems and selected some major services we wanted to address. Here, it's also difficult to see the details, but there are the beech forest in Italy and the main services, there's carbon stocks, and the cultural service of all growth. And in this respect, Italy, but also several other countries in Europe are working to introduce beech forest in the UNESCO World Heritage List. Further on, we assessed, or started to assess, it's still ongoing, the process, the conservation status of ecosystems. And we started from mature ecosystems, mainly forests, analyzing both the condition and the spatial pattern of those ecosystems. And all these maps and data and fact sheets support the identification and, of restoration priorities, and to develop or maintain a green infrastructure. And herewith, I want to focus on what is, let's say, the core area of our green infrastructure, the activities we have within the Natura 2000 network and the protected area. And in this respect, all the activities for mapping of ecosystem services is useful only if we use it as a tool for addressing policies and for conservation activities, and also for greener development of our economy. And this we made it during the last 2 years on two different strains, let's say. On one side addressed to decision makers, and on the other side addressed to people living, working in protected areas. We collected as many as possible data, information to make aware on the importance of the natural capital and also cultural capital inside of this area. And on the other side, to make evident how many economy relies on this and how many jobs are already existing and would not be possible without the conservation of these areas. This is another way to show, or it's another perspective to the payment of the ecosystem services. We don't want to make new or ask for new payments or new taxes or costs, but to make evident that the conservation of nature already is the driving force for the economy in these areas. And to do this, we start from national view on how many green jobs we have in Italy and the percent of occupation produced by green jobs, the increase of these green jobs, which is even higher of that not related to green jobs. And the added value at national scale, more than 100 billion euros. These are figures from 2 years ago, but this is to show how important this aspect of the economy is already. And then we have gone into more detailed analysis in protected areas, mainly national parks. And here is a figure. Of course, Italy didn't perform very well in GDP during the last 2 years, but it is very interesting to see that Italy has had a almost 2% reduction in the GDP over the 2 years. And this reduction was much less, 1/3 of that at national level in national parks. So we see that protected areas relying on nature, and now I will come also to this nature and cultural capital, perform better in the economy at national level or compared to the global national level. And this is something we are trying to make evident, and both decision makers and also from a bottom-up process, people living but mostly working in this area, is perceiving the importance of protecting their territory, their nature, since they really rely on these ecosystem services. And, well, I mentioned the cultural capital, and this came out at the second stage. We start from the natural capital, but investigating the economy of the natural capital, we more and more get aware that it was not possible to completely distinguish natural capital from the cultural capital. And so we started a survey with Union Camera, which is a public subject for economic aspects, to investigate the cultural productive system, which is, of course, very articulate and has several aspects which are not so strictly related to nature, but had also some part, the blue, the green one here indicated, which are related to handcraft, industrial, creative, related to nature, to food, fashion, furniture, which are very common activities related to tourism in protected areas, and contribute as well as nature, even if less, but contribute together with nature to the economy in these areas. Here I have some figure of the Natura 2000 sites, but we had the same analysis in the protected areas. We have more than 90,000 enterprises working in the cultural protective system in Natura 2000 site, 60,000 employees, 3 billion of added value for this. And again, it was less evident, but these activities performed better in protected areas, so related with natural capital, than outside. And when I say performed, the economic performance was better and produced was more resilient to the crisis in terms of jobs. And most of these activities are related to tourism and to small-scale tourism, working with nature and relying on nature, and working with typical products, food or handcraft activities in protected areas, relying on traditional activities. And this is something we are bringing and promoting to the Expo in Milano, which started a few weeks ago, and which has a particular section and a big stand, more than a stand, a structure, specifically working or addressing biodiversity and protected areas as important aspect in feeding our planet. And here we are presenting several experiences. Every week there is a national park presenting his experience on what typical products come from there, and also other aspects like the Mediterranean diet, which also has been introduced a few years ago in the World Heritage List. And just to end, I give you some advertising on the coming events in Milano at the Expo. Also, naturally, only events related with biodiversity and protected areas. So this is the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugenio, especially also for being so well in time. Very interesting indeed to bring up this aspect of cultural capital and showing how it links with ecosystem services and natural capital, and also to link it with employment and green jobs. And I think that is an avenue to explore when we communicate about preservation of ecosystem services or restoration and preserving natural capital. But still, I would suggest, the question and answer session would be after we hear all the panelists. And therefore, now I would like to invite Laurent from France, who is Director for Water and Biodiversity Issues in French Ministry for Ecology, Sustainable Development and Energy. And we hear that France is in process of developing completely new biodiversity legislation, and so we all want to know more about it. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Latvian Presidency to have invited us to make this presentation. Yes, indeed, we're just trying now to to have a new law about reconquering nature, biodiversity and landscape. I will first introduce my talk, just saying why are we doing that, why a new law has appeared as necessary for us now. First thing is that our legal context in France is that our general nature protection law is a bit old, 1976, so nearly 40 years. And in fact, it's a natural heritage preservation law, which is of course important, we'll talk about it, but it's not the only important thing nowadays. So we thought it was important to modernize this approach for not only protect our natural heritage, but also for being able to deal with functioning, ecosystem services, and so on. So we needed to update our legislation to new society, scientific concerns, such as, for instance, natural infrastructures, green infrastructures. We wanted to, and we still want to do it, with maintaining the level of environmental protection, so there is no question about lowering our ambition. We want to be more efficient, but we don't want to protect less. But we want also to simplify. Among our motivations, there is a need to have simplified procedures as one of our government priorities to have environment procedure general modernization process. We want also to better integrate to very close policies, just like marine policies, which is rather a new one because of the MSFD, the Marine Directive, and we needed to make a better link between these marine preoccupations and the nature items. So, in short, we wanted to have a more efficient framework with better linkages between many different tools. How did we do that? And we're still in process. We began with a very large stakeholders consultation process at the national level, at the local level, with the local authorities, general public, and the NGOs, and socio-economic partners, and so on. We decided also to deal with all the kind of biodiversity and protected areas, spaces, but also genetic resources, remarkable nature, but also ordinary nature, and so on. And we decided also to put a big emphasis to governance questions at the national level, with the creation of an agency. I will detail this, but also to have a better public participation, and also to improve the science policy interface, which is probably a weak point at the moment. Some policymakers and implementation use poorly the research results. The result is a 7 chapters law. First one about the new concepts. Second one about the structure of the governance at the national and the regional level. The third one about creating a French biodiversity agency. And the fourth one more specialized about some governance in the water policy field. And the fifth one to create a system to give access to genetic resources and benefit sharing, applying the Nagoya Protocol. The sixth one's about many tools reinforcing the effectiveness and the coherence of many tools for natural areas and species protections. And then the seventh one about landscape. If I concentrate about a few of the improvements we're trying to introduce by this law, first about the new concepts. As I told, one among our main motivation was to go beyond the natural heritage protection. So the project of law includes new concepts to recognize the importance of ecological process and ecological services, to be sure that ecosystem and ecosystem services dynamics are maintained. So we come from preservation of our heritage in the law to go towards preservation of adaptation abilities and adaptation abilities to maintain the level of ecosystem services. We introduce also in the law the notion of ecological solidarity, first between territories, between high biodiversity value territories and surrounding territories. For instance, it's important for national parks, where the functioning of the heart of the national park with high biodiversity value is also a consequence of what is taking place around the heart of this national park. Solidarity also between the functioning of the ecosystems and natural activities from the two directions to the services that ecosystems give to the human activities, of course, but also the impact, positive or negative, that all the main types of natural activities have on natural ecosystems. We also want to make that the prevent, reduce, compensate sequence becomes a principle of our legislation. Prevent, reduce, compensate is when there is a project. First, you have to study all the alternatives to this project to prevent damages to the biodiversity, to the natural spaces or areas. Then you have to precisely look the impacts in order to reduce them, and then at the end to compensate when what has not been prevented or reduced. So it's already done, for instance, to avoid impacts about Natura 2000 sites. But with the project of law, it would become a general principle of our legislation. And we also put the emphasis in this first chapter on national biodiversity strategy and regional biodiversity strategy. We already have, of course, a national biodiversity strategy where the voluntary involvement of stakeholders is essential. So the aim of this national strategy is to promote voluntary involvement. But we find now that it's not sufficient and it's a bit fading. It was very lively a few years ago, but now we have difficulties to get new involvements of new industry or economic actors. So we want to redynamize this national strategy, and we want also to have a better link with the action at the local level, at the regional level, with a good linkage between the regional strategies and the national one. So secondly, we renew our concept. Secondly, we create a French agency for biodiversity, which will gather several existing bodies and will be the main body for the implementation of the biodiversity recovering strategy. Our aim is that we want to have a place where all the knowledge is available, and to have a better link between the utilization of this knowledge and the concrete action, management action of protected areas of biodiversity at local field. We want also to have a body which will be able to assist all stakeholders involved in biodiversity, for example, with giving them technical, methodological support, financial support, to make the link between the research. For instance, we have in France Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle, National Museum, very important research place about nature, and the French Agency for Biodiversity will have a common unit between this museum, this national museum, and the agency, in order to have a close linkage between research results and the implementation of the policy. The agency will also be in charge of a part of the controls in the nature fields. The fact that it will be in charge only of a part of the control is, of course, a subject of lively debate now in France. Some stakeholders would like that it should take in charge all the control activities in the nature, water, and marine fields. But other stakeholders say that they don't want at all, that's the French Agency for Biodiversity, make controls, and that it should also only be a support agency, leaving the control activity to the national administration. So this is a point of debate which comes at the Parliament. With this new law will also, as I told, create an access and benefit sharing mechanism in accordance to the Nagoya Protocol from the CDB, from the Convention from Biodiversity. It's not the compulsory part of the Nagoya Protocol, because the compulsory part of the Nagoya Protocol is dealt with by the European regulation, which took place at the end of last year. It's an optional part of Nagoya Protocol, which will make us able to protect our genetic resources, because France is, of course, an important user of genetic resources with our pharmaceutical or cosmetics industries, but we are also important, we have also very important genetic resources, for instance, in our overseas territories, or in the oceans, or in the collections of our scientific institutes. So it's important for us to be able to promote a sustainable use of the genetic resources with a feedback from this genetic resource use towards the conservation and nature policies, and towards local communities of inhabitants which live from this biodiversity. This is especially the case in our overseas territory, for instance, in French Guiana. So we have twofold base for this process. First, to enhance the benefits for conservation and sustainable use, and also to give legal security to the users, researchers, private sector, and so on. So it's a kind, I mention it now because it's a case it's an example of linkage between preservation and economic use for a kind of biodiversity which is a genetic biodiversity at the gene level. So we also, with this law project, want to have more efficient toolkit, an enlarged toolkit, For instance, but these are only examples because this part of this chapter of the project of law is very big, probably a bit too big, but never mind. I will focus only on a few examples. I want to facilitate the membership for local collectivities to natural parks. Because now it's a bit complicated when a local collectivity doesn't want to be part of a natural park at the beginning. It's very difficult for it to join afterwards. So we want to facilitate the possibility to join afterwards. We want to create a contractual process for environmental commitments, for example, for agricultural land, which will be automatically transferred from owner to another owner. So we make this commitment with an owner at a moment, and afterwards, when the land is sold and transferred to another owner, the environmental commitment is still there. So it's for us an important tool to for instance, to have perennial compensation measures. We want also
3 minutes?
Yeah, it's nearly finished. We want also to have an institutional possibility to have cooperation between state, the French Biodiversity Agency, and regional activities, regional collectivities. We want to strengthen the efficiency of our police, of our nature police, with more severe penal measures. We want also to have the possibility to make compulsory measures even on agricultural practices when the biodiversity is rich enough that we need it, and where the contractual approach didn't work sufficiently enough. So we want to have the possibility, only a possibility, to have environmental constraints for very big biodiversity, very high value biodiversity territories. And we make also in this project of law a lot of proposals for the ocean protection, simplified framework for fisheries activities in marine Natura 2000 sites, which doesn't mean nothing, but general regulatory frameworks. We want also to have the possibility to regulate better the new economic activities in national seas, for instance, for production of energy. We want to have the possibility to protect fishery resources functional areas. The end of the process should be during the current year. The project of law has been discussed in our Assemblée nationale in March. It will be discussed by the Senate, in July. Normally, we should have a second lecture because I adopt very much that the two chambers will agree. So we need a second lecture at autumn in order to have a law definitely voted before the end of the year. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Laurent. Very, very interesting indeed. And there are new aspects, and I think many other member states can look how you succeed and how you integrate better. And I know that you personally are also perfect for promoting this integration because you are both sitting and working on water issues and biodiversity issues and taking part in two parallel events these days here in Riga as well. So I hope you will succeed, and I could hear there are a number of innovative approaches probably from regulatory perspective that would be interesting also for other member states to see how it works in practice. I would now like to invite Shirley from United Kingdom, who is responsible for, who is director for the country department for environment, food and rural affairs at DEFRA. And she will tell us about experiences on payments for ecosystem services and natural capital in the UK. Please.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, and I'm very grateful to the Latvian Presidency for organising this conference and giving us the chance to have such an interesting discussion. So what I'm going to do is talk a bit about the work that we've been doing on natural capital accounting, both at national level and at the corporate level, and then a little bit about some of the work we've been doing on payment for ecosystem service schemes. But I'll just start with a little bit of the context and how we got there. And I think you'll hear many echoes as I go through this, both of discussions yesterday and of discussions earlier today. So we did our UK National Ecosystem Assessment back in 2011 and published a huge, great volume of documents, a bit like some of the photographs we saw earlier. And that was the first major analysis of the UK's natural environment in terms of the benefits that it provides to society. And the real impact in it, I think, came from its economic analysis and its emphasis on the broader value of nature provided by ecosystem services. And it really concluded three major things. First, that the natural environment was critically important to society's well-being and economic prosperity. Secondly, that value was consistently undervalued in decision-making. And thirdly, that if we took that value into account when we were making decisions, we'd end up with a better, more sustainable set of overall outcomes for society. And that bit of evidence then framed a whole series of policies that were developed in various publications as shown there. And I'm now going to focus just on a couple of the specific things that we followed through from that. So there was a commitment to put natural capital at the heart of government accounting and take forward a programme of work to include it in our national accounts by 2020. And secondly, to publish an action plan to develop payment for ecosystem services. So starting with natural capital accounting, well, first of all, why do this? So we start from the concept of natural capital as natural assets that provide benefits to people. And then natural capital accounting really extends conventional accounting concepts to include that natural capital. So we use standard accounting concepts such as a balance sheet, which shows the stocks of assets, and a production account, which shows the flows of services and benefits. And the strategic case for doing this is strong because conventional measures such as GDP only tell part of the economic story. And if you look only at GDP, then the degradation of natural resources, the loss of natural services can go unnoticed because they're not being accounted for in the nation's balance sheet. And accounting also offers us a mechanism to look at changes over time and give us a rigorous framework for understanding those changes. So it can shine a light on the losses and gains and also the relative importance of different services provided by natural assets. It can highlight the links with economic activity and the pressures on natural capital. It can inform our decision making and just more generally raise awareness. So what we're actually doing, well, we're partway through our programme of work at the moment to develop our national natural capital accounts. So we sort of published a roadmap, a plan for how we were going to do that back in 2012. And we produced our first set of experimental UK natural capital accounts in 2014. We've also got a sort of set of guiding principles that we're using to develop further aspects of the accounts. And we've also produced specific accounts that underpin the overall national accounts relating to specific habitats. We've already published ones for woodland and for freshwater, and we're doing scoping studies at the moment for accounts relating to marine, peatlands, and farmland. What we've learned from that work so far, well, even though we've only done a very partial assessment of UK natural capital, we've already come up with extraordinarily large values. So expressed as an asset value over just 25 years, the components we've valued so far come out at £1.6 trillion sterling. Which is about the same as the value of the whole UK national output for a year in conventional accounts. And if you look at a particular account for woodlands, if you can value them for commercial timber alone, but if you include the value of carbon sequestration and the recreational value of woodland, you end up with a value that is 14 times greater than the commercial value again. So we're making quite good progress, but it is proving quite technically challenging, and we've still got quite a lot more to do if we're going to be able to have full accounts by 2020. In terms of corporate natural capital accounting, this is something that has been pursued very much by our independent Natural Capital Committee, recognising that an increasing number of businesses recognise that managing natural capital is important for them. So they developed a framework to help organisations think about this, again extending the traditional financial accounting frameworks. And it gives a range of benefits to businesses, helping them to understand the impact of their long-term strategy, make the best decisions, helping them to report to stakeholders or shareholders, and supports their corporate social responsibility efforts. So we've done the piloting with the Crown Estate, which is a public body, Lafarge Tarmac, which is an aggregates company, and the National Trust, which is an environmental NGO. And each of them did the pilot at a particular location to see how it worked and whether it was useful. And broadly, I think the pilots have been very successful. And just to give some examples, the National Trust looked at a particular farm, Wimpole Farm, where they had converted from conventional farming to organic farming. And if they looked at the conventional financial accounts, that showed that actually, on balance, not a huge change. As they made the transition, the outputs from the farm fell, but they could sell them for higher prices, and they were putting less inputs in. So profitability remained broadly the same. But what happened when they made that conversion was that the non-market benefits increased enormously. So when they looked at the benefits for carbon, for wildlife, for recreation, they found that the values went up by about 4 million a year. So a really big difference. For Lafarge Tarmac, they found actually that they identified ways to improve their practices in water management, to make them more efficient, and of course also have been able to tell a really good story to wider stakeholders about the restoration work that they do on quarries, not unlike some of the material we heard yesterday. But as these were pilots, of course, they also flagged up some of the challenges. You do need quite specialist expertise to do this, and there are real challenges around collecting the right data. But nonetheless, all those organisations, have got value out of it and are looking at how they can take it forward. And I think the next steps will be actually to think a bit about how can we simplify this to make the framework more accessible to more companies. Okay, moving on to payments for ecosystem services. I won't explain so much about what they are because I think we've already had that explained earlier on. But I think what we have been doing in the UK is very much looking at how can we use this as an approach to get new and additional investment into looking after the natural environment. And in particular, how can we make sure that we don't rely just on public funding? And generally speaking, the pioneers in this in the UK have been the water utility companies. So South West Water has had a project called Upstream Thinking, and United Utilities has had their SCAMP programme. And those were schemes where the water companies have been paying farmers who are upstream to manage the land in particular ways, which leads to better water quality downstream, which actually means then those utility companies need to invest less in purifying the water. So it's made good financial sense for the water companies, and it's made good financial sense for the farmers. But we wanted to do a bit of work to see whether we could go further, scale it up further, and find other approaches to this sort of work. So we set out a plan which was focused on building capacity, launching a guide on best practice, and setting up a research fund, and identify a few areas where we thought particularly there was potential. And so we've had a series of pilot projects actually testing things out on the ground and aiming to move from the theory to practice. We've commissioned 16 projects in all, and what we were trying to do was develop the proof of concept, show that we could actually make it work, get more people out there who understood, had the capacity to do this, to do a bit of sort of learning by doing, and then to spread what we learned from that. And this slide here shows the first 2 rounds of projects, which include projects from all over England and one from Wales. And they include a whole mixture of things in rural and urban areas and different policy contexts, water quality, flood risk, carbon, and landscape. And we've reviewed progress so far, covering those first 2 rounds. What we've learned, well, we've learned that we can make these things work, that they will work in a variety of contexts, including water quality, where we already had some experience, but also in maintaining cultural and recreational services and in flood risk management. And it's also got relevance for green infrastructure in towns and cities. We have got some quite good evidence about benefits, about value for money, which is really important when it comes to making business cases. And some of the specific examples that have worked, in the space of water quality, we actually ran a reverse auction. And that suggested that using that approach, we were actually able to get about a 20 to 40% improvement in value for money. And we're now interested in whether we could apply some of that in our wider agri-environment schemes. Using integrated constructed wetlands for sewage treatment looks as though that has quite good potential and delivers multiple benefits, including for biodiversity. And our pilot peatland code was able to develop some strong metrics and safeguards for companies to invest in peatland restoration with the confidence that it would deliver carbon sequestration benefits. And that was launched in 2013. It's now being taken forward by IUCN. And all of our pilots, they had good, strong stakeholder engagement and increased awareness of the concept. But I think it would be fair to say that all of them did also face some quite significant challenges. The third round of pilots have just started, so we don't have results from those yet, but we're looking at examples including actually something a bit similar to one of the ones we heard about earlier, so harvesting reeds from natural sites to maintain those natural sites and then seeking to use that as biomass to create bioenergy. We're looking at natural flood management solutions and at schemes which have multiple beneficiaries. So then just focusing really on the main lessons learned, what we think, first it does work, but I think there are quite a lot of things we need to do. We need to raise awareness and build people's confidence that actually natural solutions can be effective. We found that that has taken quite a bit of persuasion. People tend, for example, in relation to flood management, to fall back on the traditional solution of pouring concrete because that's what they recognise and are familiar with. As part of the package, you need to have something that you can actually sell if you're going to make this something that is additional. It doesn't have to be the whole part of the story, but you need it at least as part of the package. I think we found particular challenges where what you're trying to do is bring together a lot of players, so you need collective action to deliver multiple services for multiple beneficiaries. And actually just finding a way to bring everybody together and broker that, it takes time and resource to do that. We certainly need to continue to work on the metrics so that the beneficiaries can actually have confidence that they're going to get what they think they're paying for. We've made a lot of progress on that on the peatland code, but I think there's more to do still in other areas. And I think the other thing is that, you don't want to be too purist about this. So we heard earlier the definition, if you like, the technical definition of a payment for ecosystem service scheme. Well, actually, quite a lot of ours aren't quite as pure as that. But in a sense, that doesn't matter. If you can bring together something that both brings in private investment, but also requires some public input alongside that, I think that is fine, so long as you're getting more added value at the end of it. So really to conclude on that, I think we have got growing interest, but it is relatively early days. It's a relatively new set of concepts, and so we're going to need to keep on developing and learning by doing. And I think it does link back very clearly to the natural capital accounting and understanding in full the benefits that nature delivers for us. I also think we have to be clear about the sort of spatial and local diversity of ecosystems and their services, which means that you can't just design one system, one approach, and assume that it will work everywhere. You have to be flexible and devise something that's going to work in a particular location and with the particular local players that you have. So I think, we've got more to do. It will take time, but I think it is an approach that has quite a lot of potential. And then finally, when the slides get circulated, I've put there some of the links so that if you want to know more, you can follow those. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shirley, and indeed very, very valuable views, and I'm sure our colleagues from Ministry of Economy and Ministry of Finance would have loved also to listen to that, because that is about numbers, and accounting is something that they understand, and as we could hear, there are already good experiences in how to transfer the value of ecosystem services into monetary terms, and also the interesting aspect about corporate natural accounting, and that there is actually interest, and so looking forward to get to know more about it. Now we have, fortunately enough, 15 minutes, I would say, for discussions and Q&A session, so to speak, and I'm sure there might be quite a number of questions, or I hope so at least, because for me, listening to all these panelists, I could hear that they each of them touched different aspects of ecosystem services and valuing of them. I'm inclined to think that they were complementary to each other, not exactly contradictory, but I think if we leave 4 of them, they might also have a very intensive discussion and debate among themselves, because I know that there are some issues that can provoke discussion, that's for sure. And also here I would like to point out that during informal ministerial council in Riga, during lunch discussion, there were a number of these issues also touched in light of the use of natural capital financing facility funding for supporting ecosystem services payments as well. And ministers raised, or let's say they were quite cautious and raised a bit of skepticism about it. So I should stop here. I would like to open floor for discussions, questions, and then we let panelists to answer. Let's say we take 2 to 3 questions at a time. So who wants to, who has a question? Nobody. Oh, there is a brave man in a blue shirt in the middle. If you could wait for a microphone.
My name is Patrick Nuelstein, and I'm from the Netherlands, and working with a site conservation organization. And I would like to ask the French civil servant to explain a bit about having in the French nature law also the water issues, because one of our problems is the silo building within government, and the French seem to overcome that, and I'm very interested in that thought.
Thank you for your question. Well, in fact, first of all, in our national administration, the director, I'm the director for nature, water, and marine environment. So we deal with water policy and natural conservation policy at the same time. So personally, I think it's convenient, and it can be discussed, but I think it's a convenient organization. Now, when we are creating the French National Agency for Biodiversity, we would like that this agency deals with terrestrial nature, I would say, marine environment and marine biodiversity and marine natural parks and so on, and also water biodiversity issues, for instance, functioning of wetlands or of rivers and so on. And to do that, our National Agency for Water and aquatic sectors will merge in this National French Agency for Biodiversity. We would like also that the payments already dealt with in the water policy, because of our water policy in France, all the costs are paid by the water consumers and water polluters. We would like that a part of these payments for water are to be used for natural conservation policy, because we think that there is very narrow links between natural conservation policy and water policy. Of course, and it has been excellently shown by Shirley's intervention, when you have action to protect water catchment for production of drinking water. Of course, you can also protect biodiversity when you protect the functioning of a valley and protect wetlands. You protect also the town from the floods and so on. So the links are very tight. So we want to use the water payments also for nature conservation. So really, the convergences between nature and water policies are among our main priorities now.
Thank you. I also have some questions, but I see that there are some more questions in the audience.
Christina Weidemann, Baltic Environmental Forum, Latvia. So all countries which you are presenting are also marine countries. how do you deal with assessment of marine ecosystems and mapping them, because the water is even more complicated and tridimensional? Can you consider really all aspects in marine waters?
Okay, maybe before panelists start answering, maybe I could also ask my questions then, and and then we organize another round of questions if there are. So my question is, well, first is about testing my assumptions from this panel. So how far is the complementarity of what each of you presented, and where is it conflicting perhaps? Because like natural accounting, natural capital accounting is sometimes seen as a bit controversial, or there are some fears that you cannot express in monetary value things, and that they cannot be interchangeable in that sense, that ecosystems have value per se. And so I've heard this opinion, and I think there were different views also. Well, that's what I could hear. So maybe you could comment on that. So how much complementarity there is and how where the conflict perhaps starts. And the other is about the question is about how replicable are these approaches and work that you have done in your countries. We heard a number of good examples, but we also heard that it takes quite a lot of time and effort to map services and calculate the value, and lots of processes there. And if in European Union we all want to do the same in different regions, so what is the part that can be replicated in other countries and regions, and what is kind of that cannot be actually replicated? So yeah, 3 questions. Please, I don't know, whatever sequence you choose. What?
For Flanders and Belgium, I can already give a very quick and easy answer from my part. Flanders is legally competent about its terrestrial area and coastline, but the marine ecosystems, and there are, according to the MAES classifications, 3 of them, they fall under the competence of the Belgian federal government, so which is why we did not include them in our assessment. So of the 12 MAES ecosystems, we looked only at 9. So for the marine, at least at the level of the Flemish government, these are not being assessed as far as I know of. Now there are research agencies and at the federal level a ministry that deals with the North Sea, and I'm sure they would have answers on that, but at this moment, as far as I know, there is not an assessment of our marine systems taking place.
Of course, several pilot studies or experience are complementary. Once again, I want to come back to our experience, and we wanted to try it in a different way, not to see the value of the natural capital or of ecosystem services, but show clearly how many jobs or added value they produce now, and how far and it is worth to protect nature, since we get already positive effect in our economy from this. So to show that this is already our economy and we rely on this with a clear number of jobs. And this is an economy we want to promote and to protecting nature. This is what we wanted to show at local level, and what is also becoming more and more effective at local level. So I mean from a bottom-up approach, people is getting more and more aware that they rely on the nature and protected areas. We are mostly focusing this experience in protected areas, but it seems very effective at local level.
Well, to try to answer to your question, well, I don't think that there are conflicts between the approach are mainly complementary, and for instance, in France, we're making also a kind of MAES approach. What we call it EFES, evaluation of functioning of ecosystems and ecosystemic services. So it's quite convergent with what we're wanting to do. Of course, for some kind of ecosystems and ecosystem services, it's much tougher than for others. And for instance, for marine ecosystem, it's difficult. It's difficult because we lack knowledge, we lack data, we lack the methodology. But we've got one opportunity, it's the MSFD. And the MSFD monitoring program, because the MSFD monitoring program asks us to implement data collection, indicator calculation, also of the functioning of ecosystem, because MSFD is very devoted to the good functioning of marine ecosystems. So it's probably more difficult for these ecosystems than for terrestrial ones, because we know them much less. But the MSFD is an opportunity to do it. If we try to identify maybe a few differences between the approaches, and it could be a kind of question to share. In fact, when we're very interested by this approach for payment for ecosystem service, it's also something in discussion which is quite lively in France now. But a question that something we are wondering is that what can it become in the long term? For instance, will the farmers not change their mind if now it's more interesting for them to be paid for an ecosystem environmental service, but if the price of the corn or the price of the milk or I don't know what becomes higher, maybe to deliver the service will not be any more interesting for them, and so they stop, and maybe 2 years after they will want to do it again. So do you have imagined a mechanism to give some kind of perennial dispositive for the system, or is there a threat that it changes every year?
Okay, well, if I take first the question about sort of are we in conflict or are we complementary, I don't see conflict. I think it's inevitable that the precise way we talk about these things will reflect, if you like, national priorities and national cultures, but also the specific context. And a lot of what I was talking about, natural capital accounting, payment for ecosystem service, they're obviously quite technocratic and technical subjects, which are, the right way to talk to certain people. If I talk to my finance ministry about how much money they are willing to invest in environmental improvement, they will come at it from the point of view of, well, we've got hard choices to make. Do we invest in this bit of the natural environment, or do we invest in a road or a railway line or a power station or whatever? And they want some way of comparing those things. And so we try to talk their language, very much talk about the economics there. That's, of course, not necessarily how our politicians talk to the wider general public. They will perhaps be talking in terms that engage much more with the hearts of ordinary people and talk about the impact on their lives and the countryside that they love. I don't think that's a problem. I think that there are ways that these things can be entirely complementary but appropriate to the particular audience. And what we're all struggling for here is actually trying to make the best decisions that in the end bring together the best outcomes we can for our societies. I think in terms of applicability of the approaches, I think, as I said in my presentation, we've still got a long way to go. And I think one of the things in particular we will need to do with some of them is to find ways to simplify things, to work out, you know, what are the absolutely key things that you have to have as part of the approaches, and where can you afford to compromise a bit in order to make things relatively straightforward for people to use. And to answer Laurent's question, I mean, we will need to work through what kinds of technical underpinning you might need. And I can envisage that, you know, in the long run, if people are going to buy ecosystem services, they're probably going to want long-term contracts if they're in a long-term business, and there will have to be a negotiation with the landowner about whether they are willing to make that kind of long-term commitment. And yes, farmers' incomes fluctuate. We spend a lot of time hearing farmers being very worried about how their incomes fluctuate, and actually to the extent that they might be able to get some long-term security of income out of ecosystem services, I think that would be a very attractive underpinning to them, as opposed to being dependent entirely on what exchange rates are doing and commodity prices.
You want to add something?
Yes, with regard to the question you asked, at least that's how I wrote it down, how replicable are these approaches to other countries? What I said in the beginning, if you want to engage in ecosystem assessment or an ecosystem service assessment, you do not need to invent the wheel. There is merit in looking at the vehicles that have been driving around in other countries. That's what we did in Flanders, and in fact the Eugenio, which Shirley referred to, was a big inspiration for us to. For instance, the big, thick technical report as a knowledge base is something that we really, well, not copied for them, but we looked for inspiration there. Now, assessing the state and trend is a fairly generalizable exercise. The only difference there is the type of ecosystems and the data which you can have access to, and also the time and money you have for it. But next step after that is trying to use that knowledge and bring it closer to policy. And there, of course, I think that there you will have more variety. I concur with what Shirley said, that difference in national policies can result in quite different accents there in how you approach with that. In fact, in the governmental layers that we as a research institute for the Flemish government have to work with, we do not see at the Flemish level and also not at the federal level a strong demand for natural capital accounting. Maybe because they're not aware of it, or maybe because they're more distrusting of market and market-based approaches than UK or Anglo-Saxon. I'm not sure. The strongest demand for these types of tools and information systems, as we experience it in Flanders, is coming from the European level, like the European Environment Agency, also the Commission to some extent, and we try to work on that. But there's not a strong pull in that direction from the government agencies that we work with. We are currently talking to Agricultural Ministry, to Spatial Policy and Planning, and they ask for tools to make this ecosystem service data and information both in biophysical and in economic and in social impact of these changes in service levels. To make it more accessible to their policy domains, but that's not necessarily an economic or natural capital accounting approach. So I think the more you go into operationalizing these assessments and to link them to policy, you will see a greater variety depending on the priorities, the culture, the meaning of the concepts that they get in your local area.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed to all the panelists, and my colleagues informed me that all the presentations will be also made available to participants. And I would suggest that we stop now because we are already in the lunchtime, and if you have some questions spared, then I hope you memorized all the panelists very well, that you can approach them individually. But for now, yeah, enjoy the lunch and be back, please, at 2 p.m. Thank you.